Welcome to the Astrology of Crime. Today we're going to be looking at Ted Bundy. Because Bundy had killed so many people, today we're going to be focusing on the 𝐾𝐬𝐲𝐜 murders that occurred on January 15th, 1978. In the early morning hours of Jan 15, 78, an assailant broke into the 𝐾𝐬𝐲𝐜 sorority house at Florida State University and sexually assaulted and murdered 2 women. Here are some of Bundy's crimes preceding the 𝐾𝐬𝐲𝐜 murders in January 78. In January 74 was Bundy's first known attack on 18-year-old Karen Sparks, a student at University of Washington. He broke into her apartment, sexually assaulted, and beat her. Luckily, Karen Sparks survived. In February 74, Bundy broke into Linda Ann Healy's apartment, abducted and murdered her. Healy was his first confirmed murder. From January to July 74, Bundy is believed to have killed 8 additional women in Seattle: Donna Gail Manson, Susan Elaine Rancourt, Brenda Carol Ball, George Ann Hopkins, and Denise Naslund. After killing Rancourt, Bundy also killed Roberta Catherine Parks in Corvallis, Oregon. In August 74, Bundy moved to Salt Lake City to attend law school. Between October and November 74, he murdered Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura Aim, and Debbie Kent. In November 74, Bundy attempted to kidnap Carol DeRonch, but she luckily escaped. Bundy also killed Karen Eileen Campbell in January of 75. In 1975, he also murdered Julie Ann Cunningham, Denise Lynn Oliverson, Lynette Dawn Culver, and Susan Curtis. In August 1975, Bundy was pulled over by police and arrested. So we'll now talk about what led up to the 𝐾𝐬𝐲𝐜 murders. Going back to 1978, Jimmy Carter was in office. He was inaugurated in January of 77. He entered his presidency when the U.S. was in a big mess. There was stagflation, a combination of stagnant economic growth and high inflation. Unemployment was high. There was an energy crisis with high prices and shortages of oil and gas. There were Cold War tensions. The U.S. was in the midst of a Cold War with the Soviet Union. People were still reeling from Watergate. Public trust in government and the political system was still shaken. There were a lot of civil rights issues going on, ongoing debates about affirmative action, busing, and more. And international relations were not great. In Iran, for instance, there was a growing anti-American sentiment. In his inaugural address, Carter said, "Let our recent mistakes bring a resurgent commitment to the basic principles of our nation. For we know that if we despise our own government, we have no future. We recall in special times when we have stood briefly but magnificently united. In those times, no prize was beyond our grasp." The #1 song in January 15th, 78 was Baby Come Back by Player. Other music that was big around that time, How Deep Is Your Love by the Bee Gees, popular due to Saturday Night Fever, which came out in 77. Dolly Parton's Here You Come Again, Rod Stewart, You're in My Heart, Debbie Boone, You Light Up My Life, and Billy Joel, Just the Way You Are. I think he won the Grammy for that year. As for movies, #1 at the box office was Close Encounters of the Third Kind, also The Gauntlet, Saturday Night Fever, of course, Pete's Dragon, and Semi-Tough with Burt Reynolds. On the TV, you had Three's Company. Not only did you have Three's Company, actually, but you had the spinoff, The Ropers, which actually lasted longer than you would expect. Also, Angie, Mork and Mindy, Charlie's Angels, Laverne and Shirley, Good Times, MASH, All in the Family, Happy Days. TV was really great around that time. And Super Bowl 12, Dallas beat Denver 27-10 the night of the 𝐾𝐬𝐲𝐜 murders. Because Bundy was representing himself in court as his own lawyer, For a pretrial hearing in Aspen, a judge granted his request to use the courthouse library. While there and left alone unguarded, Bundy jumped 2 stories from a window and escaped. He was missing for 6 days until captured by the FBI. On December 30th, 1977, at the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, prison guards had planned to hire a welder to install extra bars in Bundy's cell after reports that he was planning to escape. But they never got around to it. Bundy removed the light fixture, slid through the 12-inch hole, crawled through the ceiling, dropped down in a different location, and walked out of jail. He had lost weight prior to this escape, so he'd be able to fit through the 12-inch holes. His lawyers had noticed that he had dropped weight, but didn't think much of it at the time. After his escape, Bundy made his way down to Tallahassee, Florida. He got housing in an apartment near the university under the name of Chris Hagen. On January 15th, 1978, he broke into the Florida State University 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 sorority house while members were asleep. He beat and strangled 2 of the women, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, to death, and beat Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, who luckily both survived the attack. In addition to the women in the 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 house, approximately 45 minutes later, Bundy attacked Cheryl Ann Thomas in her home at the Dunwoody residence, approximately 2 miles, 8 blocks away. He broke her jaw and severed a nerve ending near her ear. He fled and was not caught straight away. Luckily, Cheryl Ann Thomas survived the attack. Bundy's last known victim was 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, who he abducted near her junior high school. Experts note that this killing broke his pattern of slayings, since Leach is the only known underage victim of Bundy's. He was arrested within a week of Leach's murder after police stopped him for driving a stolen vehicle. So now we'll look at the 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 murders, which took place prior to his last slaying of Kimberly Leach. Court documents reflect that the crime was discovered around 3:14 a.m. So that's the time that we'll use for the crime chart of the 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 murders. So the first thing we look at in the crime chart is the first house to identify the victim. That's the first house cusp of the ascendant or rising sign. We have Scorpio rising. And the first house further explains what was going on with the victim, specifically their body. And we have Neptune here in the first house, and Neptune rules sleep, which is correct because the victims were sleeping when Bundy attacked. Scorpio rising depicting the victim makes Scorpio's ruler Pluto the planetary ruler of the victim. And we see that Pluto is in the 11th house in Libra, and the 11th house rules groups, clubs, including sororities, which makes sense because it was a sorority house. And that Pluto, which is the victim's planetary ruler, opposes the moon, which typically is a dark night of the soul experience. Unfortunately for these women, the dark night of the soul was actually manifested in real life in a physical form. The 7th house cusp in a crime chart identifies the perpetrator. In this crime chart, we see Taurus is at 24 degrees on the 7th house cusp, making the ruler of Taurus Venus, and Venus is in Capricorn. So Venus in Capricorn further defines the perpetrator. Ms. Neary, a witness after the crime took place, described the intruder as a young white male, clean-shaven with a dark complexion. Typically, Saturn or Capricorn is associated with a dark-complexioned person. Venus, of course, also rules beauty and charm, charisma, and by most accounts, that's how Bundy was able to succeed in his crimes prior to the 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 murders, through being charming, charismatic, good-looking, etc. So that Venus further describes our perpetrator. It's also interesting to note that Venus in Capricorn, which identifies our perpetrator, Capricorn rules teeth, and there are bite marks on the victim. We can look at Mars to show the police in a crime chart. In this crime chart, we have Mars retrograde in Leo. So because Mars is retrograde and not direct, the police are in a disadvantageous position, which makes sense because they did not catch him right after this crime. He had fled and went on to kill more. In addition to the 7th house cusp, identifying the perpetrator, which is Taurus, we also have Chiron in Taurus in the 6th house. Now, with Chiron in the 6th house, it's very likely that Bundy had stalked his victims before the attack, because the 6th house has to do with daily routines. It usually points to stalking in a crime chart. We can also look to Mercury to see if there were any witnesses. And yes, there was a witness. Somebody saw Bundy leave the 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 house after the murders took place. So Bundy's here, ruled by Venus. And then we have Mercury pretty close by. We also have a grand fire trine in this chart. We have Saturn at 29 degrees Leo. And then we have Mercury at 1 degree Capricorn. And note how that 1 degree Capricorn is just 2 degrees shy of Sagittarius, which is also fire. And then we have Chiron in Taurus at 1 degree, which is again 2 degrees shy of Aries. So that's a grand fire trine, which is usually a killer's good fortune. When you have a grand fire trine in a crime chart, it suggests that the crime was efficient and quick with little incidents or disturbance, which favors our perpetrator. It also might suggest the outward appearance of arrogance and bravado, which is the case with Ted Bundy doing these crimes. To enter a person's home when there are more than one person there is certainly arrogant and extremely risky. And now we'll look at Ted Bundy's chart. The first thing we notice is that Bundy had a bright and shiny Leo rising. This helped him to present a very confident, generous, and attractive front due to warmth. Leo is ruled by the sun, so he had the radiance of the sun around him on a first impression basis, which allowed him to lure his victims and trick them. The first house also indicates one's immediate environment. And with that Leo rising, it makes sense with Leo in the first house because Bundy struck around good times. He would scout out some of his victims in bars or discos, fairs, and the like, wherever there was good times, which is under the rulership of Leo. The first planet in somebody's natal chart after the ascendant is the first energy they encountered upon entering the world. So we see Neptune in Libra is the first experience that Bundy had when he entered this earth. And Neptune rules confusion and deception. So that was Bundy's very first experience. Louise gives birth to Ted at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. It was a really big deal to not be married when having a child. There's a lot of judgment around that during the time, 1946. So initially, Ted is given up for adoption. But then Louise, Ted's mother, her father, Ted's grandfather, wants Bundy. So Ted's grandfather wants him. They bring him back to the house and they raise him. And the family tells Ted that his grandfather is his father, and they lie to Ted and lead him to believe that his mother is his sister. So Ted is in this house growing up. He thinks that his grandfather is his father. He thinks that his mother is his sister. And the grandfather terrorizes the family. By all accounts, Ted's grandfather was a very, very violent man. And it's interesting that Ted left some of his victims for dead and he abducted others. This could allude to his animosity for being abducted, quote unquote, by his grandfather when he was going to be put up for adoption. It's interesting to note that in his assault against Karen Sparks, he split her bladder. And that first planet in Ted's chart, Neptune, is in Libra, which rules the bladder. It's part of the urinary system that works with the kidneys to get rid of waste from your blood. And why this is interesting is, although Louise didn't try to have an abortion, from what we know, she did take abortion pills. So when she was pregnant with Ted, she took what is equivalent today to the morning after pill. Yet, obviously, the abortion pills don't work. And clearly we can surmise that such pills would not be good for a baby, since the purpose of the pills is to destroy the fetus. So, in a lot of ways, energetically, Ted had a really, really hard start, right? Because he probably was trying to energetically rid of those toxic pills from his blood, which was in his body due to the mother taking abortion pills when she was pregnant with Ted. And we see with this Leo rising that Ted has, that makes the sun, because the ruler of Leo is the sun is in the 4th house of home and family, along with a lot of other planets. There's a hell of a lot of planets in his 4th house, which gives Ted a sort of a Cancerian vibe, very emotional, sensitive, very family, home-oriented, which makes sense because even in interviews, Ted spoke very, very highly of his family. Said nothing bad about them at all. That sun in the 4th house also reflects how his mother saw Ted as her pride and joy to the bitter end. And really, everybody really liked Ted on sight. He was like the boy next door. And that's probably because not only does he have a Leo rising, but all these planets in the 4th house, he makes everybody feel at home. He pulls people in. Sort of like what Cancers can do with their oceanic energy. His victims wanted to help him. They felt comfortable enough to help him, which is a very 4th house stellium type thing. Even the judge at his trial, which some of his trials you can actually see on YouTube, the judge is enamored by him. The judge is laughing at his jokes. So you'll actually see that on YouTube if you watch any of the trials. And also with this 4th house stellium, it's very emotional. So all of us are said to make decisions emotionally and then back them up with logic. But that's even more so with somebody with such a strong watery house. And Ted's not very self-aware. He had no clue when you asked him why he started committing these crimes, how he started. So he was making emotional decisions based upon his context, his foundation, his family, his background. We also see the 4th house cusp ruler is Scorpio, making Pluto the planetary ruler of his 4th house of home and family. And Pluto is in the 12th house. So Pluto in the 12th house describes his family, which makes a lot of sense. There were a lot of family secrets. They lied to Ted. And there was probably a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes, specifically trouble with Pluto there in the 12th house. This could be abuse, this could be violence, etc. Also, that Leo ascendant makes almost an exact square with his Mercury, which is in Scorpio at 24 degrees. So he has Leo at 25 degrees rising and Mercury at 24 degrees Scorpio. And that Leo ascendant squaring his Scorpio Mercury, it gives him a sharp mind, even if Mercury is retrograde. Gives him a lot of curiosity, even genius, but also there may be a tendency to second guess oneself because it is in Scorpio, which is rather suspicious, especially retrograde. And with that square, the negative aspects are more pronounced. So Ted may have been given to second guess himself, but also others. That's why he was his own lawyer in court, or one of the reasons why he represented himself, because he was paranoid that his lawyers were against him. I'm sure he also wanted to show off his knowledge and his ability to practice law. So with that Leo rising, we know that Ted was like the sun. He was charismatic, he was confident, he was bright, he really knew his audience and knew how to play to them. He also had extremely chameleon-like tendencies in the sense that people would describe him in completely different ways. I was actually surprised to not see Gemini in his big three, the big three in a chart being your sun, moon, or rising. But although he doesn't have Gemini in his big three, the moon that he has in Sagittarius opposes Uranus and Gemini. So there we have the Gemini because the moon reflects. So the moon reflects that Uranus in Gemini, which helps him to be more chameleon. We can see here the different faces of Ted. I mean, it looks very, very different in each one of these photos. Also, that moon that opposes Uranus, Uranus is about shock, and the moon pertains to mother. So when his grandfather, as we said, decided to raise him, they led him to believe that his real mom, Louise, was his sister, when really his sister was his mother. So there you have Uranus, the shock, opposing the moon, mom. So there's a certain level of shock around mother. Can you imagine growing up thinking that your sister is your sister and then later discovering that your sister is your mother? So we see that mental trauma represented by Uranus here and opposing the moon, the mother. And even if Ted wasn't led to believe that his mother was his sister, that moon opposing Uranus can also be about detachment from the female figure, the mother figure, as well as abandonment. And it works the other way. So whereas before the moon would oppose Uranus and essentially there'd be a shock that comes in regard to his mother, he did the same thing to other people. He wound up preying on women's vulnerabilities, the moon, their nurturance, their mothering instinct. He would essentially walk through parking lots and with a felt cast. He had this like cast that he would carry around with him, and he'd put his arm in this felt cast, and he would be carrying books, and he'd spill the books on the ground, and these women would see him in extremis and try to help him, and then he would hit them with a crowbar or something. So he's repeating that pattern with his mother. He gets the love that he needs from this woman, helping him pick up his books or whatever, and then he attacks and shocks her before she can attack, shock, leave, or reject him. So that Uranian trauma is being replicated, but he is now the one that is the abuser, or at least causing the shock. We also see that Ted's seventh house of partnerships is Aquarius. The 7th house cusp is an Aquarius, making Uranus the ruler of his 7th house of partnerships. So his partnerships are going to be very reflective of his relationship with his mother, because his mother, the moon, is opposing Uranus and the moon reflects. So there's like this ping pong effect with Uranus and the moon. And with Uranus ruling his 7th house cusp, his relationships are going to be reflective of his relationship with his mother. And that 7th house cusp ruled by Uranus, which also reflects his relationship with his mother due to that opposition with the moon, it speaks of Uranian themes, not just of shock, but also abandonment, detachment from a female figure. And Ted was the oldest boy of his mom's. He had a half brother and 2 half sisters. And he speaks later about the abducting of the victims and collecting their body parts, their heads, etc. He said that he wanted to possess them as you might possess a potted plant, a painting, or a Porsche. He spoke about in having these women and their body parts with him while they were dead, and sometimes when they were living, because he sometimes kidnapped them and kept them alive for a bit before killing them. He spoke about it being uninterrupted time, right? Time uninterrupted with his victims, which can very much allude to his feelings of abandonment growing up as the oldest boy, potentially. In a man's chart, Venus typically reflects what he finds attractive in a woman. In Ted's chart, he has Venus in Scorpio conjunct Mercury. So we can say that Ted liked Scorpio-like women, or women who appeared to be very Scorpio, and also smart with Mercury so close to Venus. Even if both are retrograde, that would be the case. And we notice over here with Ted's victims, most of them did have dark hair, long dark hair parted in the middle. That was a very, very common hairstyle at the time, but the dark hair does reflect what Scorpio women are said to look like. Scorpio women are also said to have short foreheads and sharp noses, sharp beak-like, eagle-like noses. And you can see that in some of the victims here with their short foreheads and their sharp noses. It's also interesting that Ted has Chiron, which is woundedness. It's your deepest wound, in the 3rd house, which rules neighborhood or neighbors, because Ted lived around his victims. So there may have been a pain associated with his neighborhood growing up that made him decide to prey on victims in his neighborhood as an adult. He would strike wherever he felt comfortable, 3rd house. And a lot of people say that Ted fantasized about committing these crimes. And in order to fantasize, well, you have to ground the scene. You have to have a setting. And that would make sense with Chiron there in the 3rd. It's also interesting to note that the 3rd house does link to Gemini, and Gemini does rule the arms, hands, and shoulders. And he would put his arm in a sling in order to entrap his victims. Now, when we look at the 12th house in a chart, we see the subconscious of the subject, and also what was going on with the mother when the baby was in the womb. So if a mother smokes a cigarette and she's pregnant, she shares that cigarette with the child. So whatever the mother is going through while the baby is inside of her is reflected in the 12th house. Over here, we see that Ted has a very, very intense, not great 12th house. We have Saturn retrograde in Leo. We have the part of fortune, meaning that his subconscious or his time before being born will make or break him. And we also have Pluto retrograde, all in his 12th house of the subconscious. So his mother most likely was really going through it, but also so was Ted when he was in his mother's belly. As we said, she tried to abort her baby with pills. So she's taking these pills to abort the baby, to kill the baby, and the baby survives. So I don't think you have to be a doctor to note that that wouldn't be very good for the baby. Goodness knows what it did destroy of the baby, though it didn't destroy the baby. And also, forceps were used for his delivery. So, of course, when you're using forceps to deliver a child, that could result in brain damage. But also, there's a sense of even more trauma right upon birth. So there's trauma for the baby when they're in the mother's belly, right? Essentially, the baby is taking these pills that the mother is putting into her body, and the baby is fighting for its life with these abortion pills. And then the baby is first greeted into this world with forceps, which could have affected his brain or also have been rather traumatic. It's also interesting to note that in 1974, when he broke into a dorm room and attacked Karen Sparks, he not only beat her with a rod from her metal bed frame, but he assaulted her with a speculum, which caused internal injuries. This is a speculum. It's a gynecological instrument, but we don't know exactly where he got the speculum. None of the students were medical students in the dorm. So did he bring this speculum? Most likely. And it's not like it's easy to just get a speculum. So I think that's interesting, especially if he was born via forceps, which it says here on the birth certificate. We also see in Ted's chart that Jupiter at 13 degrees Scorpio makes an exact square with Pluto at 13 degrees Leo. This aspect is often characterized as somebody who is overly ambitious, resourceful, and a tendency to go overboard with an all or nothing approach. Jupiter expands whatever it touches, and in an awkward square with Pluto, it expands Pluto in a negative way, which would be destruction, violence, death. We also see in Ted's chart that Mars and Jupiter are in mutual reception. They're in each other's signs. He has Jupiter in Scorpio, Mars in Sagittarius. Scorpio is traditionally ruled by Mars. Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. So the two of these energies, Mars, violence, anger, aggression, and Jupiter, lots and abundance, work together, unfortunately, in this case. Thanks so much for watching The Astrology of Crime. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We may do another one on Ted Bundy since there's so much that we can look at. Should you have any comments about this episode, I'd love to hear them. Please put them below, and I shall see you next crime.